Thank you so much with that introduction. It's of course always a hard act to follow, to actually live up to that kind of expectations. But still, the world is full of interesting things, and I'm kind of eager to investigate all of that, which typically means that my professors at university got very gray hair, and I found a lot of topics worth dealing with. So my current big project is working on a book about what I call grand futures. If we survive and get our act together, where are the limits? And it's of course a wonderful way for me to dip into everything. So I've been nerding out about superconductors recently. Today it's a total internal reflection, but I also got dragged into a conversation by my husband about some theories about political science. But that's not what I'm going to talk about here today. The topic that was kind of voted on was information hazards. And it kind of ties in. I love information. It seems to run in my family. Indeed, some of my relatives, they're all archivists. They have been gathering data, collating it, organizing it. And I think I always grew up with this very strong presumption that, of course, information is good. What could be better than sharing information? And I think this is a very important thing to realize, that this is actually historically a slightly new idea. The idea that knowledge should be shared was invented to a large degree during the Renaissance and later. Indeed, before that, many people said, oh, that's self-evidently not true. Knowledge must be kept among the select. It's wrong to share the very deep knowledge unless it's to some really worthy individual, because if unworthy people know the nice thing, fine truths, they get degraded. They get rolled in the mud. So you better keep your Euclid and magic and math away from the hoi polloi, they're bad. And the revolution that happened in the early modern era was the realization that, oh, we can figure out new things. What Roger Bacon started, literally, probably in the backyard of our institute. Our building partially overlaps with where Roger Bacon's monastery was, although it was probably in his lab on top of Folly Bridge in South Oxford he actually did his actual research work. He started to suggest that maybe we can do experiments and learn from that. And that empiricism, of course, grew, and it took quite a lot of centuries before it got into a better theory. And then Francis Bacon started formulating this grand idea that, oh, yeah, if we just develop science and learn how the universe works, we can use that for a lot of useful things, and that's going to be awesome. Now, there is something really interesting here, because that was a strong break with the previous view that actually knowledge was just to be contemplated. You don't use it. It was not nice to use knowledge to improve the world. And as we know, it took quite a long while after Bacon to actually turn it into something that actually did transform the world. But that act of saying, yeah, knowledge can be had and knowledge can be useful, was then crowned during the Enlightenment by people like Locke and others, saying, yeah, and actually we need to have an open discourse to test out things. Keeping stuff secret is not very good. Look at the advances we're now finally making when the Royal Society is publishing the letters people were previously sending privately. So eventually we ended up with a kind of consensus position that knowledge is a good thing, and we should be sharing it widely. Indeed, it might be a moral imperative to us on taxpayer money to share it to the taxpayers, whether they like it or not, what we have discovered. And of course, education is a great thing. And societies run on openness and transparency, etc. Now, I think I want to bring this up because when you talk about information hazards, our community, people kind of like to play around with these concepts, quite often are a little bit too ready to then say, oh, and Bostrom was right about information hazards, and that's why we need to keep everything secret. It's kind of useful to recognize that there has been this weird balance between people having a tendency to conceal information for both good and bad reasons, and a consensus that has been built painstakingly culturally across our civilization over the past few centuries, which also has its own complications and internal contradictions. So I think the cool part here is to recognize that knowledge can be useful, but some knowledge can be bad. Now, I don't know how much you care about PowerPoint poisoning. I'm probably not going to be running on PowerPoint because that is just a little bit too annoying. But you can just imagine me, of course, putting up a lot of PowerPoint slides with these classic posters on loose lips sink ships. There are some things you want to keep secret. And it's kind of obvious that we want to keep, at least during a war, military information secret. And of course, there is other information, as many of the Second World War posters would point out, with various spies picking up puzzle pieces. The enemy might actually be interested not just in obviously sensitive information, but for example, how much toilet paper an office is buying. That tells you how many people are working at that office. And if the office is working on something super secret, the toilet paper doesn't reveal important information. But normally we tend to think that that kind of situation is weird. That's cloak and dagger stuff. But it turns out that this kind of information hazards, where you get risks that arise from dissemination or potential dissemination of true information that then can cause harm either directly or through some agent. It shows up in a lot of very, very different forms. One form that has become very important these days socially is spoilers. When I grew up, spoiling something was a bit rude. That's it. This was, of course, back in the ancient 70s, so nobody remembers it. Now, the interesting thing here is, over time, spoilers has become much more problematic. And that might just be because we're living in a more media-saturated society, but also being part of the community around Game of Thrones or The Expanse or something else. There is so much more to it than just something to talk about whether it was a nice movie to watch. So spoilers has become a big deal, and also it's easier to distribute spoilers. So it also become a bigger faux pas to accidentally spoil something important. And this is interesting because the harm involved is not tremendous. It's not like anybody normally dies when you mention too much about what's going on in the last season of Game of Thrones. Well, outside Game of Thrones. Inside Game of Thrones, of course, everybody's dying. But the interesting part here is that there is quite a lot of domains that have these properties. So Nick Bostrom outlined in his paper, Information Hazards, a typology of potential harms from knowledge, a long list. And out of Nick's papers, this is probably one of my lower third favorite. I find it rather dry. There is some really interesting stuff in there, but it really, really annoys me. I'm going to come back to why that is. But the obvious thing is, of course, the adversarial risks, where you imagine spies or the enemies who want to steal your secret, or a smaller subset of other risks. There are things like norm hazards. If I go out and mention that I'm doing something slightly bad, it's not bad in itself. If I'm pirating movies, well, yeah, maybe it's I'm doing something illegal or slightly immoral, but now I'm making it easier for others to say, yeah, but Anders is doing that. In that case, it's okay. And before we all know it, we're all pirating movies, or maybe pirating science, or maybe copying cars with our 3D printers or something else that might be a problem. Of course, whether it actually is a problem depends quite a lot on other issues of value here. The formal structure might not necessarily mean that there is a problem. There is also really, really big bunch of risks that are linked to human irrationality and error. In some cases, it might just be distraction. I have a tremendous tendency to bring up weird and wonderful topics at the academic meetings. And some of them are fly paper topics like consciousness, personal identity, IQ. And then the conversation gets derailed into that topic. In a sense, talking about the nature of consciousness is not an information hazard. But maybe if this was a meeting about AI safety, I'm actually doing real harm in the greater world by adding something that is predictably distracting. Similarly, we have various forms of bias. So one of the ongoing arguments I have with Nick Bostrom is how much I'm allowed to mention numbers to him, because he's very aware of anchoring cognitive bias. If I mention that my old phone number in Sweden was 835591, and then ask you about, okay, what's the population of Argentina? Statistically, you're now going to gravitate towards 83 million, which obviously has nothing to do with my phone number, but because of me mentioning that number, I'm now biasing you. And it's a low-level phenomenon. Just because you know it doesn't mean that you can avoid it. So in some situations, this might be a real problem because this might bias conversations. So Nick Bostrom and me, we have this good-natured argument that I'm not allowed to really bring up any numbers or simulations before I'm 100% certain that the numbers are not going to be moving around wildly when I discover bugs or extra considerations. This, of course, gets Nick a lot of peace and quiet because I will never, ever reach that point, and I'm not going to bother him with a lot of random numbers. But of course, we are exposed to this all the time, and sometimes it might be quite aware. Similarly, there are these complicated valuable states. Spoilers are actually a quite subtle thing. In some cases, actually mentioning true information about a third party might make you relate to them in a different way, even though you might intend not to do that. And there are various forms of embarrassment where you mention something true that has happened and somebody is terribly embarrassed, and actually it's not a win for everybody. Finally, we might, of course, have things that are directly dangerous in themselves, whether that is an epileptic flickering light, or maybe hypothetical thought experiments that make people of certain mindset go bonkers in various ways. And of course, you could imagine having just plain code for making a malicious AI, or a very nice set of instructions for doing very dangerous biotechnology or other things. Generally, I like to practically bunch up information hazards in three big categories. There are the external information hazards, where actually they make a malicious adversary or a clumsy agent to cause harm. If I tell somebody that if you mix substance A and substance B, you get the big explosion, some people are going to be stupid and do that. Then there are direct information hazards, which are very curious and also very rare. That's where you get the immediate direct harm. And then there is a nasty set, which are mindset hazards. Basically, these are information hazards to us as Bayesian agents. We change and update ourselves a little bit, and that might mean that we actually learn something that is bad for our further behavior. So one interesting example of this is negative learning. So there was a good paper by Oppenheimer about climate a few years ago, where he pointed out that if you look at models of climate, they have been moving around in the space of whether climate tends to oscillate, is stable or unstable in a fairly messy way. It has changed quite a lot over time. And all over time, we have improved the models. We have better data, we have better models, but the conclusions have actually shifted around a fair bit as things got refined. Partially this is because that learning that went into the model might actually have meant that once you learn enough, you get a different outcome. But when you learn a little bit more, you might return to the first outcome. So in some systems, getting extra information does not necessarily move you in the right direction. In the long run, when you get to infinity of information, you should, of course, as a perfect Bayesian, end up there. But that might be the very long run. Similarly, there are other simple things. There are information hazards that are just predictable. If I run my climate model and realize everybody else has been wrong and climate change is 5% smaller than expected because of this numerical bug in a library, I better tell IPCC about that. But I better not tell Fox News about it, because Fox News is going to spin it in a particular way and get a lot of people to react to that, even though that very small update, it actually shouldn't update your views on climate change very much. It's a little bit like the problem of what is the likelihood of acquiring the HIV virus through unprotected sex. The actual number is usually smaller than people expect. So if people actually knew that number, it's fairly likely that a bunch of people are going to have unprotected sex and get AIDS from that. So it's a kind of a good thing that people don't quite know the exact numbers. Yet it feels very wrong to say, yeah, we should hide it from them. That's obviously also a problem, because in research, of course, we really, really want to be trustworthy. And indeed, in research and policy work, the real important thing is you want to tell people truthful things, or things that move them in a truthful manner, and build trust. And building trust involves people checking that you're telling them everything you know, and you're not leaving things out, or not bending the truth in the wrong kind of way. So if it ever comes out that you're leaving out stuff, you're going to be in trouble. And this is, of course, a real problem, because mindset hazards are much more subtle. At least we can kind of understand what the problem with an enhanced smallpox genome could be. It's much less clear whether telling a certain fact could be misunderstood or lead to the wrong kind of thinking. Indeed, quite a lot of academics seem to have a very strongly overestimated view of their own ability to do that. So generally, this matters a lot when you try to do research about global catastrophic and existential risk. So Thomas Morris said the double power principle is that the more power something has for good, the more it has correspondingly for ill. It's not strictly true for everything, but I think it's a good rule of thumb. If your research can change the world, then you better be a bit careful, because some changes are not good. So if we think that X-risk research could have a long-term effect on the world, we should expect by symmetry to occasionally come up with really dangerous ideas, which means that we might end up with data hazards like dangerous data, databases of vulnerabilities in our civilization, idea hazards like doomsday weapons. I have this unfortunate tendency to come up with doomsday weapons almost like a hobby. Nick has told me I'm not allowed to do it on business hours at least. But there are also attention hazards, even bringing up some topics like, oh, this is a sensitive domain and bad things could happen if people work in that. Uh-oh, now you mention it, and a lot of people get interested for all sorts of reasons. And there might also be subtle things like scaring the public or policymakers. Steven Pinker had this, in my opinion, very stupid, but unfortunately to 25% correct argument that, well, the total sum of worry in society is constant. So if you bring up AI risk, there's going to be less worry left over for climate change, which is a serious thing, and that's bad. So hence, AI risk should not be discussed. I think this is a terrible, terrible argument. On the other hand, he has a point. When you bring up different risks, a lot of people tend to actually allocate worry in ways that I don't think are rational. And it might actually be that you want to be a bit strategic about what things you put on top of the agenda. Indeed, you probably have a moral reason to try to make sure that the agenda has a priority list that makes sense. Now, I have been doing a fair bit of work on thinking about how research organizations like the Future Humanity Institute should be trying to handle this kind of information safety. And it comes up in a lot of different ways. The traditional one is, of course, actual information safety and security engineering, the stuff you get in thick textbooks that you then get various letters after your CV if you get through. So there have been this ongoing debate, well, locks or computer security flaws, should you tell the world that they are unsafe, which is going to help the bad guys, but it's also going to help the good guys to balance things. This has been going on since the 1600s, and the solution we have in computer science is typically, yeah, let's do responsible disclosure. Contact the people making the lock or the software, tell them that you found the problem and explain it. Hopefully they will then fix it, and then you can announce it a few months later. You might also say that you have some time limit, because if they don't fix it, then we might want to tell the world anyway. It's an interesting case because here you need to model who the adversaries are. The people who pick locks generally know a lot more about locks than the normal users. So if you have discovered a vulnerability in locks and doors, probably they know it. So if you can rediscover something relatively easy, it's probably a good thing to tell the rest of the world about it. You're not spreading rare information around. But this might not be true in all domains. In some cases, it can get very interesting. There is some arguments you can make that there is a single paper that made the opioid crisis worse. So the Siegfried fentanyl synthesis paper from the 90s was a breakthrough in making fentanyl much more easily. Before that, most outbreaks of fentanyl consisted of, the drug has been around for a long time, but typically what happens was the police started finding addicts dead by overdoses. And when they traced it back, they usually found an anesthesiologist who was kind of taking some fentanyl and selling it on the street. So when they nabbed the anesthesiologist, they stopped that outbreak. Gradually changed, so it was sometimes organic chemists working at chemistry companies, but again, they need to be fairly good to do it. Then the synthesis pathway got shortened by a bunch of papers, and the Siegfried paper basically halved the length of it. Suddenly, anybody who can brew drugs could do it fairly well. That didn't create the opioid crisis. There was a lot of other social and other factors coming in. But suddenly, one of the things blocking the production of fentanyl had been removed. And at least in the RAND report about the opioid crisis is putting a fair bit of blame on this single paper. It's actually a pretty good example of an interesting information hazard. You made something dangerous much easier. The world has a little bit less protection against that. This is, of course, very similar to discussions we have about gain-of-function research. So ways of making the flus, for example, spread between mammals. Okay, it's useful maybe to know how that works, but those papers are also giving hints on how to make a more dangerous pandemic disease. On the other hand, if you're a bioterrorist and you want to use a flu as your bioterror weapon, you're probably a slightly wussy bioterrorist. In some sense, yeah, in the large, you might actually be killing much more people than if you go for anthrax. But on the other hand, it's not a very directable bioweapon. It's actually not super dangerous. Except, of course, we might imagine somebody coming up with tools from gain of function combined with something nastier. And at this point, it would be very bad if it happened. So that debate went on, and the most interesting thing is, of course, okay, should we have some kind of pre-checking before you publish papers? What can you leave in and leave out? In the case of the flu in the papers, people were focusing mostly on the genome, which I don't think was actually telling the story very much. While the methodology for doing gain of function was there in the paper and was fairly obvious, and I don't think enough people were noting that's probably the scary part. Similarly, you might have other problems with your papers. I found an interesting report about some herpetologists studying rare geckos and other lizards in South China. And every time they published a paper about the lizards, that population began to decline. And after a while, they started to cotton on that something was weird here. And they realized that, oh, it's not just herpetologists reading our papers, they're also collectors. So by identifying a new rare species, they put a big bullseye on that one. So now the collectors knew where to connect it. So in this case, the important thing was you might want to publish the paper, but you don't want to reveal where the species is. You might have to put that information in Scrow at the Linnean Society or somewhere else. The problem is, of course, some of the effects can be rather subtle. In the 70s, there was a fairly intense debate about what kind of science should not be made. There was even a theme issue of a philosophy journal named Forbidden Knowledge, where a bunch of intellectuals were kind of attacking this question. And generally, many were thinking, yeah, it's relatively rare that knowledge should be forbidden. Peter Singer had a lovely paper where he argued that, well, it's the applications that matter, and can we predict whether there are good or bad applications? But there are other people who think that, yeah, the mere awareness of something can be bad. So there were some public intellectuals that very strongly were arguing intelligence and genetics must never be combined in a study. You must never, ever figure out the genetics of intelligence, because that's going to support racism. And they were making the argument very strongly that this research should be banned, literally banned. They wanted actual laws against doing that, because if that ever happened, then we would end up in a racist dystopia. Now, we might argue about whether we are in a racist dystopia, but we don't seem to be in a racist dystopia because of genome-wide association studies. That's not really the problem. These predictions about the imminent destructive effects of that kind of knowledge didn't hold very well, yet were made with very strong force by public intellectuals, many of which are still in the game and are still making pronouncements about stuff. That suggests that we have a bit of a problem when we think about these kind of information hazards. So generally, I've been going through the literature and trying to steal good ideas, whether that is from the intelligence community or computer security or from other domains. And to sum up my findings, it seems like openness is actually a really powerful thing, especially because many eyes can find the errors. It's not just open source that is benefiting. Actually, I was even told by some people working at a national nuclear lab that the most secret projects are always really crappy, because very few people get a chance to say that that quark bomb can never work because of this and that. While the less secret projects, well, a lot of people could poke around and say, have you thought about this? Have you thought about heating up the warhead? And that really helps. It also seems that the culture is super important for actually driving a good information hazard safety inside an organization. I was actually spending a fair bit of time going to nice meetings with the British establishment and chatting over a glass of wine or tea with various people with interesting titles. And the generic thing they told me about how they kept secrets in the organization was, well, we bring in the new people, we explain that it's very serious stuff we're doing, we have them sign a paper saying that they understand this and they should keep secret. And then everybody understands that and keep a bit of an eye on each other and think that it's an important thing to keep an eye on each other and not leak too much. One military person said, yeah, I'm always mumbling something about waterboarding while we're signing that paper. That really helps. The nice thing about this method is, of course, that most of the time you never need to waterboard anybody or bring up that piece of paper, because people don't want to do a bad job. People don't want to leak information or do stupid stuff, and they don't want to let their friends down. I think one of the problems when you think about information hazards in the abstract is that we forget they are going to happen inside actual organizations. Relatively few really powerful ideas come from single individuals. Typically, they have to be developed in teams. And those teams need to be trustworthy, and we keep each other trustworthy and test trustworthiness to that point. The problem is many of the formal tests are too weak. After all, if you do a vetting of people supposed to work with American intelligence secrets, a strong, firm belief in the Constitution seems to be a good thing to have. Indeed, that vetting process mostly seems to be good at getting rid of obviously the wrong people, the people who are stupid, too sociopathic, and too much gambling debt or too much alcoholism and other stuff. But somebody like Snowden, who's really obsessed with the Constitution, on paper, he looks like the perfect guy, except that if you have a little bit of a principal agent problem vis-a-vis the Constitution, he might suddenly become an enormous liability for the organization. So many of these formal methods are having an interesting problem. There is a lot of things to be said, of course, about can we steal cool ideas from security engineering and information security, and that's useful if you want to organize things. Similarly, the intelligence agencies, they have a lot of experience in keeping things secret, sometimes too secret, because they actually do forget a lot of the relevant information. And classification systems in general, they might be relatively mild. Security clearances, on the other hand, seem to foster a strong culture of keeping things secret, because your clearance is important for not just your job security, but it becomes part of your identity. And the end result is, of course, that people protect their identity by trying to keep things secret. On the other hand, leaking has become easier and easier, and there is also a change in the intelligence community. The people they recruit don't have the same values. Indeed, the people doing the vetting and deciding who gets to have a clearance seem to be diverging more and more from the mainstream views, which means that there might be a real big problem for recruiting, or that you get an intelligence community composed of people who fit a certain template that's not very like the rest of society. Generally, it seems also that trying to keep something really secret that's important is hard. There is that idea that conspiracies are everywhere, and the evidence doesn't seem to support that. That could be because we're living in conspiracy land and the Illuminati are actually very successful and everybody but me is in the Illuminati. But in practice, it seems like most conspiracies don't work that well. We can test this by looking at cartels. This is actually a fairly common phenomenon because it's kind of a good thing if you're in business to try to team up with your competitors and make a lot of money. And it turns out that median time from forming to discovery of the discovered cartels is about 5 years. But some have lasted decades. The oldest one, I think, had lasted for 95 years before finally somebody of the third generation leaked about. But generally, they work well because very few collaborate. If you have the typical James Bond villain project with hundreds of underlings and minions assembling your rocket, it's fairly unlikely that we're not going to be leaking. Even when you have something like the Manhattan Project, you actually end up having to patch a lot of holes. The Manhattan Project was leaking all over the place, even though people were fairly serious about security, both as a society, as people working for the US Army, and because there was an assiduous counterintelligence effort. Yet, of course, the Soviet spies were getting a hold of not just blueprints, but samples. So there are some serious problems about doing it like that. If you actually want to keep something secret, make sure few people know it. It's something that one can deal with by compartmentalizing, which on the other hand means that you're going to reinvent the wheel a lot. Or you can try to organize it in other ways. Generally, the worst problem here is that in many situations, people try to do information hazard management without talking to anybody. They kind of realize that there's a problem, but unless we have formal rules, and it feels kind of weird to bring it up during the coffee time in the office, so they are doing something on their own. And the end result is a lot of very shoddy information hazard management. A lot of it is academic censorship. It turns out that actually a shockingly high percentage of academics have refrained from publishing certain things or researching certain things because we're worried about the consequences. In some cases because of canceling, in some cases because, well, that's going to be so controversial, in some cases because they think nobody else seems to be talking about this, so this is probably a bad thing. And then, of course, their postdocs and grad students pick this up, even when they don't say anything. And quite often they reach a very random conclusion about why this is so. When you actually examine the ideas about what you shouldn't talk about, they're all over the place and don't correlate very much with reality. So this is another reason why you want to talk about information hazards and how you want to manage them. Even though you might not want to mention the hazard itself, you actually want to have a conversation. You want to be able to compare them. So these unspoken rules and internalized censorship can lead to all sorts of disasters. There is a very good book by Chernov and Stornet, Information Concealment in Man-Made Disasters, which is just a bunch of case studies ranging from dams crashing to Chernobyl to 3 Mile Island to various chemical disasters, looking at how people were hiding information. And it's everywhere. Before the disaster, during the disaster, and after the disaster. And a lot of it is, of course, just cover your own ass. You're trying to sell yourself or the company or fix your reputation. In some cases, you're really afraid of causing a panic. There is this myth of mass panic that if people knew the truth, they would riot. Actually, it turns out that if people know that there is a crisis, they become very well behaved and do very sensible things in a polite fashion up until the point when they lose hope or lose trust in the authorities. But a lot of people are hiding information because they think it makes sense. And since you can't exactly see that, there is a lot of shoddy information hiding, which then later leads to bad things happening. The Chernobyl disaster, for example, a lot of the problems stemmed from that important information was actually being kept actively away from nuclear engineers who would have benefited from knowing it. So 3 Mile Island was on the first page of Pravda, that capitalist nuclear power plants have trouble. That's good news. But what the trouble was, which was indeed recounted in Western newspaper, was kept out. Because that was, of course, foreign nuclear secrets. So actually the Soviet nuclear engineers shouldn't know that unless they had a need to know basis. Okay, so to sum up, where are we? What should we do? Well, we should recognize that the weapon of openness is quite powerful. And just because you realize that some information is dangerous, doesn't mean you need to go immediately into full James Bond mode and try to take it to your grave or do some heavy encryption to keep it away. Trying to figure out the balance in a gentle manner is quite important. And then it's also important to realize that what really matters is, of course, the decision-relevant information. The rare and the hard to rediscover information, that matters the most. telling people about generic things or things they can find just by looking at Wikipedia, well, maybe that is going to help the laziest malicious actors. But lazy malicious actors are rarely the problem. Generally, you can use fairly standard risk management principles for information hazards. But one should recognize that these methods are never going to be that perfect. You should recognize that there is a half-life of the secrecy of everything. Sooner or later, it might leak, or somebody rediscovered it. Which means that if you think that you're really the first, you have an interesting leverage situation and you want to think carefully about the implications. So there is the unilateralist curse that I wrote a paper with Nick and Tom Douglas. When you think that it's enough that me and some of the other people out there could release this information, in that case, what should I do? Maybe I should become much more cautious if it is a bad idea to release it. But on the other hand, I also need to do a proper evaluation. And generally, we shouldn't think that we're great at judging hazard. This is why we actually need to talk to each other about it. We might want to set up systems both to report to authorities when we see something that makes us nervous, or ways of even announcing that I discovered something in this vicinity without revealing it. The other people who discovered something in that vicinity, also without revealing, can contact me. You could imagine actually having some form of zero knowledge proof or a hashing that would allow people to notice that there are other people working on something here and set up a proper protocol for actually trying to share a bit of knowledge to do, build things. But generally, you want to construct trust. And you want to work on concrete near mode issues than making up grand principles and thinking far mode. I've been suggesting a bit of a institutional framework where you have information wardens and helping a team to handle the information right and getting the checking out grants and new recruits, etc. But this might need to be tied to what kind of information you're dealing with. And that might be very different. Sometimes it's mostly about framing. When you discover your disturbing result, maybe you want to formulate it in a very dry format and send it to a very dry journal and then email that to the right researchers. In some cases, it might just be that you want to put information into escrow. In some cases, you might want to actually say, we need an institution here. Let's go and start forming an institution. Well, that was kind of an overall big, very hand-wavy overview of stuff. I'm very happy to answer questions and discuss this much further. So, thank you.
Thank you, Anders. And let's just imagine everyone's clapping. There's actually a clap button, but a mute, you can't hear it. It's out there.
On Skype in the office, we usually write applause in the chat, which is kind of hilarious because everybody's sitting there just at the end waiting to just press return to send out applause. Thanks, Dana.
Okay, great. So I'm going to read out some questions. Rachel Freeman asks, how concerned should AI safety researchers be about publishing their research? For example, value learning from human modeling as an information hazard?
I think it's a very tricky question to answer as stated because it's too wide. I think there might be some risky information there, but most of it is probably actually really a good thing because understanding value learning better, that's a key step in making better value alignment. If we say value learning, we better keep that under lock and key. We have this international value learning vetting association. Every paper needs to be sent past that before it gets to be on ArcSight. We're slowing down the field quite a bit. But that might not mean much because we might be people inventing the same things and just putting them into a commercial product. We want to figure out where are the dangerous corners of value learning. I think that is easier to discover actually than just looking at general value learning. But the balance of openness versus closeness is important. Nick has an interesting paper on that. I disagree with him on a lot, but he generally argues that in the early days of AI research, like now, openness is actually a pretty good thing. Later on, we might actually want to be a bit more careful, but then it might be too late.
Okay, so Gennady Stolyarov asks, is there not a component of the recipient's individual responsibility? If the person communicating the idea does so truthfully with a rational mindset, would you agree that recipients have the responsibility to process it reasonably and that the communicator is not culpable. And if the recipients have logical fallacies or irrational responses, it's their fault.
Yeah, I think there is some truth to that. Everybody has a responsibility because we're all kind of nodes in the big cognitive network of our civilization. And just as we have a kind of moral duty when we take information we have learned and then send it on, to make sure that we try to do some filtering, some checking, making sure it doesn't get too biased in that process, because by bouncing around across the internet, of course, any information gets super biased. We might say, yeah, there is a moral responsibility here. Just like we have a responsibility, I think, to do a charitable reading of messages we get. The problem is, of course, not all information is easy to discern whether it's dangerous. My favorite example is some of the photos of a Trinity nuclear test that were given to Life magazine by the US military. And well, what information can you get out of a picture of a nuclear fireball? Well, there was a British engineer by name of Taylor who immediately used some dimensional analysis from those photos to calculate the yield and actually figure out quite a lot of important things about the bomb in the 40s. Because the people sending the information to the newspaper didn't recognize that it actually did contain potentially dangerous stuff.
Okay, so Connor Leahy is asking, could sanity-destroying Lovecraftian eldritch knowledge realistically exist in our universe? Defining it as some knowledge that reliably produces strong and catastrophic changes in any human that learns it.
I think there is too much variability in our brains. So it's pretty obvious that normal natural stimuli don't generate anything that belongs in the stories at SCP Foundation and Lovecraft. We don't see people normally that destroyed by knowledge. Sometimes it does happen that somebody does get kind of destroyed by an idea, but it's really rare. And typically these people tend to be rather exceptional. The real problem is, can we then conclude that, yeah, you can't actually get that kind of knowledge in the universe? I think that's tricky because as adversarial learning in neural network demonstrates, an apparently sensible perceptual system, actually, if you have a right way of finding something that breaks it or gets it into a weird state, you can relatively easily generate something. It might just be that such processes are very, very rare in nature, but we could, of course, discern them. Indeed, you could probably put me in an MRI machine, send the pictures to me, and probably try to use gradient descent learning to figure out how to give me an epileptic seizure or something like that. But that might have to be very fine-tuned to me. I think our brains are too high variance and too noisy for this to robustly work. But I don't know if this is true. And it might be that we should not really investigate this too carefully.
Okay. Krishnan Siddharth asks, can we imagine philosophical knowledge, i.e. not scientific or engineering knowledge, that is an information hazard? Some folks think that utilitarianism can be an information hazard because authoritarians can use utilitarian arguments as cover for genocide or atrocities, as for example, Stalin or Mao.
Well, you can probably use any argument as an excuse. So that part doesn't work. But you could imagine that suppose we actually get a philosophical consensus that something is true and it has an affordance that makes it easy to use in a particular way. So utilitarianism, for example, tend to lend itself to maximizing thinking. It seems to hint that there are some things that should be maximized. And then you could imagine that suppose we actually got the consensus among philosophers, utilitarianism is true. And then some government says, yeah, and we're going to maximize utility. And that's why we're setting up these camps. All the utilitarians might be screaming and saying, no, you're doing it totally wrong. You're actually not maximizing utility. But the government would then say, hey, we read your papers. This is how we interpret them. We know what we're doing. So is this a likely occurrence? But historically, unfortunately, we have seen a lot of examples of that. Is it true that there could also be really bad philosophical knowledge that maybe also leads a civilization into crash? Again, I think humans and civilization are a little bit too diverse and maybe not truth track enough to actually latch onto these things. But I can imagine that there could be very, very disturbing conclusions in philosophy. We might actually find that the true state of the universe is kind of profoundly unsettling. in many ways, I like Lovecraft because he was seeing the universe as I like to think about it. And he was kind of screaming and running about the way while I'm kind of embracing Cthulhu. And I want to become something Yog-Sothoth of like in the degenerate far future where the planets are all neutronium. And Lovecraft would, of course, be just staring at me and say, yeah, but the tea parties, the sensible the social discourse in Providence, that has no meaning in that weird world. Yeah, but I would be very happy with my VR and Jupiter brains and stuff. There is a kind of fundamental disconnect. And that disconnect might be quite profound. Indeed, many medieval people would probably say, yeah, you already tapped into Lovecraftian knowledge. You stopped really believing in God like we do. You're all going to go to hell, which is a literal place in the middle of earth with fire and brimstone, by the way. And that's because of you got bad philosophical knowledge. We might, of course, say that we know what we're doing, but, well, one should always be open for the possibility of being wrong.
Okay. Jade asks, given that there are a lot of info hazards that are tempting to share for prestige reasons, how does one distinguish info hazards in such a way that one can mitigate one's own bias?
Yeah. Generally, I think the best thing is when the hazards are boring. I once was thinking about making an artwork that would be contained in the genome of a doomsday pathogen. I kind of came up with an idea for. And then I realized, okay, this is very, very cool. It would probably actually get some points for art merit. And yeah, it's just plain stupid. It was my ego acting up. The problem is, of course, you do get power by having secrets. And I think one should just wean oneself from doing that. I think we should learn to get a kind of a prestige by being cool, interesting, kind, and fun, but not by revealing stuff that should not be revealed. In fact, we should recognize that revealing stuff you shouldn't reveal is a sign that you're slightly untrustworthy. Partially, I'm involved in the project on information as a kind of punishment from Nick for having a tendency to blab about stuff I shouldn't be blabbing about. Hopefully, I'm going to learn kind of my lesson. We'll see about that. I might be a slow learner. But I do think recognizing that maybe we shouldn't value secret knowledge so highly. We should actually recognize that actually it has a lot of nasty hierarchical baggage.
Okay. So Les Ronger asks, you mentioned that researchers in HIV likely overreported the infection rate or made people think the infection rate was higher than it was. This makes sense. Could it make sense for researchers to underreport the severity or probability of certain existential risk events? For example, global warming might already be past the point that anything we do can meaningfully help us avoid the damage. Assuming this is true, if researchers were to share this information with the public, it might lead many people not caring about their impact on the environment, so it might make things worse. So how should researchers go about communicating risks to the general public if this is true?
So we had a very good conversation a while ago inside the Institute about what about some risks that have power law distributions, but you can expect to have a bunch of really big events before you get to one that is terminal. And one idea would be, actually, those warning shots are great. A horrible disaster happens and people learn from it and say, never again. And sometimes that seems to happen. Europe after the Second World War seemed to have gotten the message in some domains. One reason for the European Union is to deliberately bind together the continent to make sure that it's unlikely that wars will happen. We got all sorts of legal and ethical institutions. The problem is, we can also see in psychology of hurricane evacuations that sometimes people get the totally wrong message. So they get hit by a hurricane, but it wasn't that bad. They survived. Okay, hurricanes then are felt to be smaller problems and they're less likely. So I think there is a problem that if we try to second guess the public or civilization, we tend to get it wrong. We simply should not play that game. That's just not going to work well. So in some cases, it might be that, yeah, letting people have these accidents might teach them something. But most of the time, it's better to actually warn about it. Similarly, it's not telling people things, I think, is bad. Telling people things that they will misunderstand is also bad. You want to tell them in such a way that they actually end up with the right conclusion. which again requires a fair bit of forethought and thinking and balancing, and it's not always that easy. So in the climate example, for example, the climate scientists should probably be saying, yeah, things are getting very, very tight and expensive here, but here are a few things we really, really need to do, and we need to do it urgently, without necessarily saying that they think it's too late in that case.
Okay, Artie and Merrick are asking, what should a person do if they want to handle a potential info hazard responsibly and want to avoid the shoddy methods you mentioned from trying to do such a thing alone, but don't trust the relevant research community to be aligned and or competent?
That is a very important thing, because many research communities have their own peculiar style. So during the debate about the gain of function flu research, for example, a lot of flu researchers were defending it, saying this is great. After all, pandemic flu is killing a lot of people, so any research aimed at reducing that is good. And then next door, the HIV researchers and the other biosafety and virology research were kind of banging on the door saying, no, don't do it, this is stupid. They had similar knowledge. They understood epidemiology and many of the things, except that we didn't get too much about the flu virus itself. But we understood the general field. And they were not beholden to any particular interpretation. And I think this is also how I would go about. If I discovered that, this piece of knowledge is dangerous, and I think everybody in the field will totally go in the wrong way, I would look at nearby fields that have the same knowledge and then try to talk to sensible people inside those fields.
Okay, Gustav Zilgavis is asking, what are your thoughts on information in the context of Bostrom's vulnerable world hypothesis? In other words, information about diverging values.
So the vulnerable world hypothesis, I've been working in my book on what I call the fragile world hypothesis, except that then Dave Mannheim published a paper with that, so I need to change it again to something else because it's slightly different thing. The question is, how dangerous technologies can we expect to find? And I have been trying to look at what do we know about the physics of the universe. And it seems like on one side, stuff that blows up, there seem to be fairly nice limits of that. The law of the energy conservation and thermodynamics actually make the universe much safer. The light speed limit is a wonderful, wonderful safe-making thing. So this means that it's relatively unlikely that the kind of surprise nuclear weapon-like thing. Similarly, we can rule out certain things like toxins. It's rather hard to get a toxin around. Self-replicating threats, on the other hand, they seem to be a problem. And we don't have a good theory about self-replication. And of course, information is the best self-replicator of all. So it seems to me that this is an open hole in our understanding. We probably need to learn more about the information hazards and the information replication. Then, of course, the different kinds of replication you can get and the different ways of handling that is a rather rich domain. I mentioned early on that I was a bit annoyed with Nick's original information hazard paper. And the reason I'm annoyed is that it ends on a cliffhanger. It says, oh, these are information hazards. And what do we do about them? Well, see the sequel paper, which has not yet arrived. I'm kind of hoping to write it because I hate having that kind of cliffhanger. And I think similar, the vulnerable world hypothesis paper is almost like as bad as that. It kind of leaves things open. We need sequels. We need an entire franchise of dealing with this.
Marcin Wozniak asks, how do we deal with information hazards that exist for smaller groups, such as companies or nation states, but are beneficial for larger groups, such as society, humanity, or animals? Yeah,
so I think ideally you want to deal with that, like you try to set up incentives to handle the individuals versus groups versus society conflict. So, for example, it's very beneficial if people who are members of criminal groups or cartels actually tell the authorities what's going on. Do you want to reward them for that in the appropriate way? The problem is if you set the incentives wrong, of course, you're going to get really problematic behavior. So this is tricky, but I think incentive design is the right approach. You want to make sure that people should reveal information hazard right. But the problem is usually there isn't the right person to do it to. When it comes to biosafety, Special Agent Edward Yu at FBI has kind of almost cornered the global market of being the sensible go-to person. He established very nice links to the biohacking community, and everybody knows that if you see something scary in the lab, he might actually be the one you should tell. Not just in the US, also in the UK, because in the UK it was much less clear who you are supposed to call. So in this case, we have a problem that it's a one-man institution. We probably need to clone him and have at least one Edward Yu in every country, which might be slightly tricky. But we need to build that institution. And I think many cases we realize, we should recognize that we need to construct a lot more small institutions to deal with this. Okay, let's see. Yeah, I think that's the spelling of name.
Okay, good. So Mr. R asks, which societies do you expect to deal better with info hazards? How do you expect that to change in the near to midterm future? And providing societies tend towards total surveillance, would info hazards become unavoidable?
So total surveillance doesn't necessarily help or hinder information hazards because it depends quite a lot on how they feed into the situation. So one of the interesting things about a very authoritarian surveillance society like China is that there are many authorities there that are keeping tabs on people and keeping tabs on each other, and they're very keen on hiding information from each other because it's very bad for your career inside the party if the bad news comes around, which is one reason why the coronavirus crisis got where it got, because local authorities felt that it would be bad news if Wuhan was implicated again in some disease outbreak, so they didn't do the reporting they ought to have done. So I think there is a fundamental problem in certain hierarchical organizations that you don't want to tell your boss bad news. So you might reframe things. And yeah, maybe your boss could totally use his surveillance powers to read everything and see everything you've seen, except of course that his time is valuable. He's busy. He's not going to do a super careful look unless it really matters. And even then, if you gave the right framing, he might actually go with your interpretation. Because if there is one thing we have noticed in this world of surveillance cameras and cell phone evidence, is of course that the interpretation of a complicated, fast, messy event is actually up in there. So the problem is, I think societies that handle information hazard well are the ones that can handle the unilateralist curse, can set up incentives, and can actually create institutions on the fly that work well. It's a little bit like how we make up privacy in various environments and figure out what is appropriate. Societies that try to do a top-down, let's define a solution for everybody, might do a very good solution if they're right, but that might only work for the information hazards and the problems they have planned for. And I think the most interesting and dangerous information hazards are the surprise ones, the knowledge that nobody had. For example, during the Manhattan Project, they had a patent office in Los Alamos, and they did patents for all the parts of a nuclear weapon. So they would be part of the US patent system. And if somebody was trying to patent a device that they had already patented, then that would both be blocked, and there was clauses about buying out that patent and making sure that they kept quiet about the technology. So this was a very useful way of actually safeguarding that knowledge inside the system. And the people involved were also looking for spies and totally missed the Soviet spies because they're looking for German spies. So the problem is information can leak out in a lot of surprising directions. And this is where I think a brittle hierarchical system tends to do badly. While the more flexible ones, they tend to leak information, but they also try to repair things much more quickly.
Okay, well, thank you. Would anybody like to speak up? We can have a few more minutes where people can, ask their questions out loud now before we break up into breakout rooms. So you can unmute. There's a mute button, or you can do a space bar and ask a question if you'd like.
I'll go.
Hello.
So it seems like there's a lot of, there's a lot of secret kind of information hazards, things you're talking about, like the Manhattan Project, which happened among a small group of people. But if you look at something like Twitter, it seems like there's a whole lot of outrage about possible information hazards, or people think things are information hazards. So people think talking about polyamories are information hazard, or saying that there are, talking about actual data about immigration and race, those things are information hazards. People have even said you shouldn't categorize people at all because that's an information hazard. And it seems like information hazards are really causing a lot of the outrage culture that we see now, which I didn't really hear you talk about that much.
Well, I don't think actually, well, first of all, I think the mainstream outrage culture, if there is such a thing, doesn't actually use the concept of information hazard very much. I think this is something we find more on our own intellectual corner. But certainly, I think many of us tend to apply the term information hazard to an awful lot of different things. There are reputation hazards. If it comes out that I have a really bad taste in fiction, somebody might be looking into my bookshelf and notice my crappy taste for romance fiction, that might be really, really bad for my reputation. Except, yeah, technically that's an information hazard, but we should probably not try to handle it inside the category of information hazards, simply because we have a better understanding of reputations. When it comes to what kind of data is dangerous, well, the Chinese Communist Party thinks that essentially all public information in China is in some sense an information hazard because some enemy could use it against China. So hence we need to keep it all secret. And well, that's about secrecy. That's about overreach. Technically, the right that some smart enemy could probably make use of the number of pedestrians in northern Huangxi on Tuesdays. But most likely, no, that's an excuse, just keep control. So I do think one should be careful about calling everything information hazard. So sometimes we have much better everyday terms for it. Sometimes it's useful to recognize that those everyday things are part of a bigger infrastructure, including, of course, an infrastructure of outrage. But there, the outrage is probably the hazardous part. That's the thing that does the damage. It's not like outrage culture is doing a lot of great things and occasionally slipping. I think outrage culture itself, oh, this means doing stuff without actually caring too much about consequences. I think it's much better if you want social change to try to assess consequences and have the right information. And even, of course, say, and this information would be used against that minority. So let's find ways of having privacy about it without necessarily calling too much attention to it. A lot of privacy rules, unfortunately, make us so totally hyper aware about small pieces of privacy information, privacy or personal related information that doesn't matter, which is really problematic because then we're looking at those ones and overlooking the big holes where all our apps are essentially tracking where we are at any point in time.
Yes, I have a question regarding your thoughts on John Stuart Mill's ideas in his treatise on liberty, where he articulated the notion that all arguments, all substantive information essentially should be communicated in the public sphere because the flawed, the fallacious information will get weeded out through public discourse. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on how this relates to the current social media environment, where there is a lot of irrationality, there is a lot of this outrage culture that has been mentioned. But John Stuart Mill's hope was if all of these ideas were exposed to public scrutiny, the rational voices would win out. The more thoughtful voices would analyze this information, filter out the truth, reject the falsehood, and that's why we should allow all ideas to be entertained. Do you think our experience up to now has validated this hypothesis, or do you think some refinements to it are needed in light of what we observe on social media?
So I think John Stuart Mill was basically right, and I also adore his optimism and faith in humans. The problem is, of course, the marketplace of ideas takes a long while to settle. So I'm totally convinced that in 20 or 50 years' time, we will have seen what ideas from 2020 are actually worthwhile, and we can ignore the dross. The problem is that's very far in the future. And in the meantime, of course, bad ideas can spread around. The real problem seems to be that the ecosystem going on with ideas has changed. Even my use of the term ecosystem as a metaphor is kind of telling, because to Mill, there was an agora, a marketplace of idea. People are talking to each other, and yes, there are things happening in parallel, but it's a generally fairly sedate thing. In the afternoon, everybody have heard of ideas and can consider them together. That's not possible today. We have this fire hose of ideas, and indeed, there are various fitnesses of ideas, many of which are totally unrelated to the truthfulness. In fact, many of the least truthful ideas have the highest fitness simply because they can be adapted to spread very fast. Does that mean he was wrong? No, but I do think that we need to figure out better ways of structuring the agora. Even the ancient Greek agora had a fair bit of structure. Now, the best kind of structure also emerged fairly organically, so the users of them find them legitimate. I think we need to work quite a bit on that. But this is going to be a long and very messy process.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
So should we distinguish between information hazards and knowledge hazards? So the difference being between bad ideas or wrong ideas spreading, which perhaps can be prevented by these kinds of million arguments or million agoras, whereas knowledge hazards, which are sort of things that are true about the world, such as how to develop nuclear weapons or bioweapons, that in a way don't really, you can't really, because they're right, you can't quite weed out bad arguments in a way.
Yeah, the existence of nuclear weapons is in itself a very powerful piece of knowledge. There is this story that when the Soviet nuclear weapons team heard about the Americans detonating a hydrogen bomb, they were very happy because, okay, now we know it can be done. Now we can very easily figure it out. And basically, yeah, they had 3 different choices, and choice number 2, I think it was, turned out to be the way to do it. And the marketplace of ideas here is kind of very special. So John Stuart Mill was still kind of thinking in the term of Locke's thinking about, well, we have this empirical knowledge and disagreement, and then we refine them by arguing and get better ideas. But we are all imperfect and confused, so there is this slow improvement. But there are different functions and different streams of these ideas. So the nuclear weapon knowledge is how-to knowledge. But then we also have value knowledge, if that is even knowledge. Maybe it's just values. And you have various things in between. And we might need to actually refine our epistemology. I actually think this could potentially be the golden age of epistemology, especially if we wrest it out of the hands of the philosophers. Don't tell my colleagues in the faculty about that I said that, but I do think that one of the biggest breakthroughs in epistemology in recent years was the Good Judgment Project. And we have to thank DARPA, not a philosophy department, for doing that. Because there seemed to be quite a lot of need to get accurate information about the world. A lot of people want entertainment or tribal affiliation information or just something to really feel well for. They're valid, if potentially dangerous uses too. But there is actually quite a lot of people who would be willing to pay a lot to actually know what is the correct state of the world by various standards of correctness, of course. So I do think there is something for us to do here.